can to actually what I should do is I should share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. I wonder if you could pop that back again, Judith.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. So share and there we go. So you can see that, can you? Cool. Excellent. All right. So I'd like to begin by marking myself. And by marking, it's something that I learned recently in a reading group that we run. By marking myself, I mean the following. And here I draw on a recent book by the geographer and scientist and artist Max Liboiron called Pollution is Colonialism. A book I can't recommend highly enough. It's absolutely fabulous. Liboiron's book is about plastics and pollution, but it's also about how to do anti-colonial research. And Liboiron writes that within contemporary critical scholarships, it's common to introduce, for instance, Indigenous authors with their nation or cultural affiliation, while white and settler scholars almost always remain unmarked. This unmarking is one act among many that recenters settlers or whiteness as an unexceptional norm, while deviations are marked or named. And Simone de Beauvoir called this positionality in Second Sex, both positive and the neutral, when she wrote about the then more common use of a man to designate human beings in general. So to mark myself, the accent you're hearing is Western Canadian, Anglophone white settler. Although I've worked at the University of Bristol since 2007, I was born in Western Canada of Scottish immigrant parents. I grew up on a farm and later was educated also in Western Canada, earning degrees in philosophy and sociology. And while white settler is less identifiable where I live in England, in Bristol, it doesn't make as much sense here as it does perhaps in North America or other post-colonial countries. As you'll hear tonight, when it comes to doing critique and being critical, I think the term settler maintains a purchase as a label for the exclusionary work of territorializing cognition and education that is often neutralized by the term critique. So some of the themes that I'll speak to this evening, I've been considering for some time, and they draw in part from a forthcoming chapter in a book on indigeneity and justice, published by Athabasca University Press. And as Judith has mentioned, I've also addressed some of these themes in the edited volume I put together a few years ago, which is part of the Routledge series on decoloniality and postcolonialisms that I edit. And you might be interested in some recent titles in the series that address questions of education, a forthcoming one and two recently published. In this past work, I've reflected on what I call the coloniality of critique. In short, how the work of critique and being critical reproduces, often unwittingly, long-standing patterns of power that ensue from modernity and colonialism. I've argued that critique is one of the central designs or grammars through which coloniality settles or territorializes subjectivity and what counts as knowledge production. We need, I think, not simply to critique coloniality, but also extend decolonizing imperatives to how critique and what we take to be the work of thinking critically territorializes itself as a grammar of colonial power. Tonight, I'll present a sketch of these arguments by extending the question of decolonizing critique to the problematic of the educational subject. I say problematic because I think there are many of us who are scholars, I'd hasten to add possibly all of us who are scholars, are engaged in what I think is a performative contradiction. Most, if not all of us, would concur with the assertion that our professional lives as scholars are dedicated to doing critique, being critical, and fostering and measuring critique in the attainment of others. Here on the screen, I show just a simple expression of where criteria for critique, or what Immanuel Kant in 1784 famously called maturity, where these things are employed as markers for attaining the courage to use independent understanding. What you see on the screen are the undergraduate marking criteria we use within our School of Geographical Sciences to assess work submitted by our students. Here you can see highlighted across the marking scales, and we're kind of unique. We use a strange 21-point scale, where 20 is outstandingly amazing, and all the way down to 1 and 2, which are not great. So across the marking scales, the expectation is written that criticality marks characteristics of sophistication, originality, independence, and analytical rigor we expect in our students. We expect criticality as one of the key markers of educated maturity because we expect it of ourselves as modern knowledge producers. In our research and teaching, we strive for originality and reflexivity. Rigor is defined as the self-conscious evaluation of evidence, whether empirical or theoretical. Critique and being critical are defined in large part as employing the courage of our own understanding without the guidance of another. And here I'm simply drawing from Kant's famous definition that a mature capacity is akin to enlightenment. This is from the famous opening passage of his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? An Answer to the Question, where he defines enlightenment not simply as the capacity to use one's understanding, but as the courage to use one's understanding without the guidance of another. Hence his legendary dictum, saper aude, have the courage to use your own understanding. One, or your own here, refers to an individual subject who learns their inherent independent, originating, and self-referential subjectivity. Kant's work lies at the basis of what we call the critical tradition. It was within and through critique, which he theorized as the self's reflexive recognition of its own individual cognitive limits, that courage could be realized as freedom. Critique, arguably dominant from Kant onwards, although we'll see in a minute where there were significant precursors with thinkers like Diderot, became one of the key grammars or logics for constituting the form of modern power we recognize today as the liberal human subject. Critique for Kant, and indeed for later thinkers, perhaps more famously somebody like Foucault, came to form what is distinctive about the attitude of modernity. Foucault called it, in response to, and indeed in extension of Kant, the historical critical attitude, whose permanent reactivation as attitude defines the ethos of our historical era. And for him, critique was the ethical and aesthetic engagement, or the ethical and aesthetic, as he said, perhaps agonistic or permanent reactivation of this attitude that was fundamental to what he meant by critique. And he's drawing explicitly from and quite self-consciously from Kant. Critique is the learned, cultivated capacity to say no to structures of power, to demand independent evidence, to reflect on capacities as both possibility and limit, and to hold ourselves and others to account. In an essay on decolonization and critical thinking, the education and pedagogic scholar theorist Bell Hooks writes that college professors are enablers of students' capacities to work against what she terms dominator culture, She writes, those of us who work in education have been particularly fortunate because individually we're able to work against reinforcing dominator culture and biases with little or no resistance. College professors have tremendous freedom in the classroom. Our major difficulty is sharing knowledge from an unbiased and or decolonized standpoint with students who are so deeply mired in dominator culture that they're not open to learning new ways of thinking and knowing. Earlier in the same book, in an essay on critical thinking, she notes that, quote, individual professors aim to educate as the practice of freedom. In these settings, thinking, and most especially critical thinking, is what matters. Students don't become, she continues, critical thinkers overnight. So a bit like, she's explicitly within a Kantian tradition, but they do build on what she terms the heartbeat of critical thinking, the longing to know, which forms their organic predisposition to be critical thinkers. Hooks here speaks directly within the Kantian genealogy. And although I much admire her simplicity of speaking and her scholarship, I can't help but feel that here she veers into a rather reductive naivety, one that doesn't examine critique and criticality sufficiently. I can't help but feel that despite Hook's aliveness to the needs of contemporary education, and the fact that she's not incorrect that many educators do have important freedoms that most universities still seek to protect, she's really rather wrong about an institutionalized professoriate not reproducing a dominator culture. I think we do reproduce this dominator culture, and especially in our often well-meaning edification of critique. As to whether critically we might be predisposed organically, this is a fascinating question and maybe one we'll come to at the end, but it's not helped by her characterization of critique as, in another location she writes, self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective. It's the way the self or educated subject is unreconstructedly produced by the appeal to critique that I think becomes problematic. Critique has been invented rather as a modern reasoned and reasonable virtue. It's something that specific kinds of thinkers learn to do in the world, and it emerges from a specific geography, a specific culture, and a specific history, namely the modern tradition that's given rise to various humanisms, scientific, liberal, Marxist, etc. This modern colonial geography, culture, and history is nevertheless increasingly questioned. This is now well recognized within the social sciences and humanities, and indeed the physical sciences. It's questioned and problematized by discourses that point out our always already interdependencies with other living and non-living systems, the exclusions these discourses have perpetuated, and the need to refashion and reorient our geographical, historical, and cultural touchstones. As the decolonial scholar Nelson Maldonado Torres argues in a recent essay on decolonial critique, I shared my paper with him, and he engages the paper I'm speaking from and to a little bit in this essay, but his is a journal article that came out recently, and the chapter that I wrote is not quite out yet. So it's a really interesting article. He argues in this recent essay that if Western modernity is or has been colonial in character, then one has to consider the question of whether critique is also colonial or entangled with coloniality. We must, as educators, not only reconsider critique, but also how each of us upholds and reinforces it as a cardinal virtue, and one that has specific effects in the world, like producing subjects. This question applies, I think, to those of us interested in decolonizing the social sciences and humanities, but it also applies to a wider and now quite profuse set of recent important discourses that champion decentering approaches to the subject. I'm thinking here of posthumanism, science and technology studies, science, technology, and society studies, affect and embodiment theory, new materialisms on the agency of matter, queer, relational, ecological, and ontological critiques, as well as, of course, to those decolonizing bodies of knowledge like Indigenous, Black, and so on that long predated these newer discursive turns. And even for those of us who don't do any of these, but who simply don't wish to reproduce colonial forms of thinking, these too are implicated in the coloniality of critique. Maldonado Torres has in his paper, he suggests that decolonization and decoloniality refers to much more than simply creating space to accommodate non-European authors in courses and textbooks, but he asks us to consider what he calls several questionable presuppositions that remain and continue, namely that critique is an unqualified good, that critique is the quintessential component of theoretical practice, that it's the established canon that best represents the possible configurations of the body of critical thinking, and to which we sort of add in other voices, and that philosophy, theory, and critique are fundamentally European concern or inventions and affairs. More than question, I think, I argue two things. First, critique, that modern criteria we foster as critical scholars and hold as the highest value of engaged scholarship, is actually part and parcel of reproducing coloniality. That's because the specific form critique takes is one we as modern academics are responsible for shaping as a modern virtue in our research and teaching. And it's the prejudices of this critique that I think we must now question. Critique does not exist as a passive space or capacity that one discovers. It's a cultivated praxis and action with assumptions and effects. Our repeated production of it as educators lies at the basis of colonial forms of knowledge production. Perhaps in a way we've even naturalized it as the basis for what constitutes self-conscious reflection and reflexivity. It has become the inviolable basis for analysis, decision-making, and action, so that despite even critiques of humanisms, critique itself remains a naturalizing humanist grammar. This is problematic, I think, because that reflexive grammar reproduces the forms we often seek to overcome. The liberal human subject, for instance. What's more, in virtue of its self-reflexive limits, critique can't produce or affirm the basis for just action. Normative critique emerges from and reproduces a nature-culture distinction and a political removal from the conditions of our interdependence that undergird the genealogy and possibility of thought. Grammars of critique reproduce dependence on a reflexive subjectivity falsely removed from its material and lively, its ecological conditions. This grammar also excludes non-modern and non-European worlds as uncritical. And we must look instead to, I think, conditions rather than contracts, but conditions like things like love. Maldonado Torres talks about decolonial love, to these many relational ecologies that shape the possibility for the questioning critique invokes. And these are conditions like care and love and respect, humility, reciprocity, which I read as ecological grounds out of which conditions for just action emerge. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, I think. So let's just go back to this question of why is critique, as we've learned to reproduce it, colonial? Critique is a key cognitive and lived grammar in the process of becoming a modern subject. Through it, we learn to constitute limits of modernity, its evident horrors, as well as its many benefits. Importantly, critique reveals itself within both a rationalized global era of liberal democratic nation states governed by international law, which we label in part modern, and within the individual reflexive capacity and responsibility of a subject to analyze the constituents of its era, and by doing so hold itself in them to account. Critique is this rigorous, interrogative self-analysis that inverts power, fixity, and certainty It undoes itself, as Wendy Brown argues. Because, as Denis Diderot wrote in 1765, some 15 years or more before Kant's treatise on critique and reason, critique is sovereign to everything. Tout est soumis à sa loi. Everything is subject to its law. I find it really interesting here in this little quote that is taken from his complete works in the Salon of 1765, which concerns itself with aesthetics and painting, that he writes, "What Malherbe said about death, I would almost say of critique. Everything is subject to its law." There's a really interesting kind of naturalization of critique here, that, you know, there's death and not taxes, but death and critique, and those are our cosmological frames, or the Enlightenment's cosmological frames. While critique is ostensibly necessary for unveiling the hidden injustices of modern structural responsibility, critique, it would seem, is also never very far from the very things it seeks to overcome: violence, injustice, ecological harm, alienation, discrimination, etc. An acute and honed criticality is essential, after all, to enacting or enforcing a piece of legislation or recommending a policy in the belief that it is just and civil, or, as is unfortunately just as common, in the deliberate effort to discriminate and deceive. The question I'm asking here is part of a larger attempt to unsettle sedimented assumptions about critique. Critique, or at least in the normative form we perpetuate, may be part of the problem because it's fundamentally a negative project. Its task is not to commit to positive claims about the world, but to question any claim and its reasoning. Its only positive commitment is to itself, in Diderot's terms, to its sovereign law, to the recognition that everything could have been different. As the cultural historian Reinhard Koselleck argued in his famous book on crisis and critique, the genesis of modernity lies in the constitutive interplay of critique and the crises that critique produces. Both critique and crisis have roots in the same Greek verb, krinein, which in its classical form has an array of meanings related to the actions of choosing, judging, and deciding. Critique can be understood as the task of making a judgment, as well as an action that makes it necessary to make a decision, or one that calls for a decision. Crisis, in turn, refers to a state of affairs that requires a decision because it's no longer stable. Critique brings about crisis, and crisis requires critique, a judgment or a decision. And for Koselleck, if everything is subject to critical analysis and everything can be thought differently, then everything is up for permanent decision. Everything is in a state of crisis and open to critique, which produces new crises. And so you get this dialectic right here between critique and crisis that determines modernity. And it's this irresolvable tension of critique producing crisis, which demands more critique, etc., that Koselleck referred to as the pathogenesis of modernity. Critique's virtue, its value, lies in its relentless self-analysis. Nothing is beyond question. Its modern attitude forms the reasoned right and responsibility to say no in the face of authority. The modern architect of critique, Kant, puts it this way: reason must in all its undertaking subject itself to criticism. Should it limit freedom of criticism by any prohibitions, it must harm itself, drawing upon itself a damaging suspicion. Nothing is so important through its usefulness, nothing so sacred that it can be exempted from its searching examination, which knows no respect for persons. Reason depends on this freedom for its very existence. For the modern, since Kant, critique is precisely the navigation of this self-awareness in and for its limitations. In phenomenological and constructivist orthodoxies, a rational science and hermeneutic of perception and experience is possible. And from that, epistemological understanding about the experience of reason is also possible. Transcendental conditions, that is, conditions for the possibility of critique, are those revealed in a science of the mind for a subject limited to and separated from the object world that gives itself as experience. Phenomenalism and one's critical responsibility to what is sayable about evidence produces and ever refines a necessary distinction between a cultural subject and a natural object, between culture and nature. Educational responsibility, and with it justice, emerges as a reflexive attention to itself, insofar as this attention is also to the rational subject's fundamental epistemic separation from others and the world. For a critical philosophy, word and world are riven and completely unbridgeable. This responsibility is ethical as well as epistemic because its reflection emerges in the recognition of necessary subjective limits. And it's this fundamental unbridgeability that constitutes the importance of Kant's critique in his morality and his ethics and his aesthetics, and also picked up later by Foucault and Foucault's reflections on aesthetics and ethics. Critique, in other words, emerges from and depends upon a nature-culture distinction, or the normative forms of critique that we reproduce today. It requires conceptualizing the subject as both self-reflecting and as separated in thought and culture from its worlds, or what is constructed as nature. Critique and the learned capacity of being critical promotes, therefore, a universal subjectivity that constructs individual autonomy in this cognitive separation, and for all peoples, from its plural and its relational causes or its constituents. My argument is not that we should cease fostering the rigorous forms of evaluation or the questions that criticality asks. Speaking truth to power is as important now as it ever was. My worry is that by assuming critique is the chief architect of this holding to account, we do two problematic things. First, we perhaps unknowingly reproduce problematic nature-culture separations and so promote, perhaps also unknowingly, problematic forms of universal subjectivity and individual cognitive autonomy. And second, in reproducing this cognitive exercise as the adjudicator of reflexive legitimacy, we also foreclose the commitments of other life worlds as political possibilities. Universalizing, territorializing, appropriating, excluding in the name of epistemic, ethical, and just action. These are the tropes of coloniality. They're also the tropes of how critique becomes the measure of the educated subject. In its modern form, the critical educated subject is formed by what Walter Mignolo terms a monotopic consciousness, mono meaning single, topic meaning place. The critical subject is original both in how it naturalizes itself as law, as courageous, and in its imperative. It needs to learn to exercise its originality in a form of emergent maturity. The critical subject is individualized in its self-reflexivity. Self-consciousness refers to a single human consciousness. We give degrees and grant voting rights to named individuals, bounded within and responsible to their own reasoned limits, limits that exclude their microbiome and the ecological agencies that the microbiome make possible. The critical subject is exclusive, that is, it excludes any sovereignty, indeed any relation other than those cognitive ones emergent within itself. It questions any relation other than those it generates as the conditions of its own limits. And importantly, it's universalizable. In virtue of its criticality, it can be critical in any context, place, or time. Here lies the enormous hubris that decolonial and indigenous scholars have increasingly sought to refuse, the modern conceit that all worlds are accessible to research. More than universalizable, critique eradicates history, place, and time and casts them out as tradition in its embrace of the new and the original, We learn to be good critical subjects through the modern educational process, and then are sent out as emissaries, as settlers of modernity. In a sense, critical subjects are archetypal settlers. Their job is to settle worlds on the basis of an inviolable, reason-giving, individualistic, naturalized courage, which in spite of place erects a structure for what counts as legitimate understanding. To invoke the often quoted Patrick Wolfe on settler colonialism, critique is a complex social formation and as a continuity through time that is a structure rather than as an event. It's in light of these characteristics that I and others like Maldonado Torres read critique as in need of decolonizing. Torres, in his paper, turns to Fanon to argue that other forms of self-criticism are examples of critique. Fanon and Torres, I've gone a bit too far. Fanon and Torres give the examples of the North African gemmas and the West African palavers. In these non-European spaces, the principal features of critique take different forms. Fanon writes of these as communal forms of self-criticism, where the referent of the subject may not be an individualized human, but a part of a wider collective and hence a public. The conflicts that arise in villages, Fanon writes, should be settled in public via the gemma in a form of communal self-criticism and with a note of humor because everybody is relaxed, Fanon writes, and because in the last resort, we all want the same things. Palavers reflect a more complex and perhaps more telling story. Palaver in British English today has come to be a pejorative. It refers to an unnecessarily drawn out trouble or bother, something involving much tedium, talk, or negotiation. You know, you say, oh, it's such a palaver, that latest teaching and learning meeting, or the bureaucracy to get something done, etc. But palaver, interestingly, derives from the West African Portuguese pidgin palavra, which referred to making palaver, a dialogue or a conference between African tribespeople and traders. In West African English, it colloquially refers to a dispute or quarrel that requires arbitration. The arbitration happens in palaver courts, palaver houses, palaver rooms, or under palaver trees, forms of which are or have been practiced in multiple sub-Saharan West and Central African countries, including Angola and the DRC, Cameroon, Ghana, Liberia, Mali, Senegal, as well as some Eastern African countries like Ethiopia and Madagascar. Fleur Kashida cites Benitez Bujo, a theologian, and Masamba Mpolo, also a theologian, on the palaver, where the palaver is characterized as a space for open communication by which persons are integrated into the life and expectations of their communities. This space can be physical, as when community members gather under the ancestral tree or at the grave of a deceased family member, but more importantly, it is psychological and a social space for open communication. I think it's really interesting here to note A, the presence of the tree, and B, the presence of ancestrality in the ways in which temporality and reflection and discussion and dialogue, how that relationality constitutes itself. So the palaver is used, as she writes, to work out solutions to a family or community's problems. So something that needs decision that happens in a dialogue. And it's a praxis that supports a community's well-being even through difficult times, making it an excellent resource. She was particularly interested in researching it to think about post-conflict resolution, reconciliation. But fundamentally, it's rooted in a communality. For worlds like the gemma or the palaver to become recognized as legitimate rather than simply appropriated and epistemically represented within the liberal critical apparatus, we need to query the ethical and cognitive foundations that give rise to its most cherished values and institutions, including the liberal subject and its constitutive grammar, critique. Self-criticism here is not only located in the monotopic self-reference of an individualized, self-reflecting, and isolated subject, but is ethically constituted in its multiplicities of place. It's familial, communal, more than human, and ancestral. Its temporal relations are fundamentally important to its polytopic self-criticism. Self-criticism here recognizes what Mignola terms a challenge to the myth of the universality-grounded ego politics of knowledge. The decolonizing anchor becomes I am where I do and think, which is not the simple and common sense think where you are, but refers more importantly to the fact that the thinker constitutes themselves as a self, the I am, in the place that you think. The you is multiple. And that the place is not a room or an office, but the place as it is assembled and configured materially, culturally, economically, politically, etc. This is referred to in Sheeta's paper, where she also says that the palaver is quite akin to the much more common and well-known Ubuntu, where the definition of Ubuntu is humanity caught up in and inextricably bound up in yours. I am human because I belong and I share. And it's, as we're all familiar, perhaps it's rendered into English as I am because we are, which is fundamentally the antithesis of the Kantian critical subject, which refuses that relationality and whose criticality depends upon that refusal. The political scientist Robbie Shilliam calls such work the decolonial science of grounding. Knowledge should not be produced for Shilliam, but instead cultivated, tilled. The constitutive relational matter that makes possible thought should be folded back onto itself so as to rebind and encourage growth. Cultivation, he writes, infers habitation, which means that knowledge is creatively released as the practitioner enfolds her or himself in the communal matter of his or her inquiry. This process necessarily interacts with a wider biotope, enfolding matter from other habitations. He points us in his book towards the Maori practice and principle of Wakapapa, which entails recognizing the many constitutive relationships to land and land's temporalities as the constitutive grounds within which the self understands and within which the relational self-criticism emerges. The decolonial concern with modern critique as it's currently formulated and upheld within colonial apparatuses like the modern university is that critique traps an abstracted model of the thinker in a cycle of isolated self-analysis without addressing the motive constitution of this subject itself. Indeed, when it posits limit as the limit of thought and action, it reproduces and imposes reflexive critique as an interpretive frame for possible politics and justice. This frame inheres culture as separate from its constituting relations and reflexive thought as an individual capacity over which a linguistically separated subject has autonomous responsibility. I've suggested thus far that critique has become one of the key logics of coloniality, but that it also operates under the guise of epistemic value. Maldonado Torres goes a bit further and suggests that critical theory actually contributes to catastrophe. Here he writes, mainstream critical theory operates with the presumption that critical theorists are subjects who either create or respond to crisis through critique. It's extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible, for critical theorists to perceive the extent to which their practices and presuppositions contribute to catastrophe. Recognizing how established practices of knowledge production and critique advance catastrophe and how therefore they make people, including critical theorists, unable to speak and think properly would be a good place to start to consider the possibility of decolonial critique and decolonial struggle. Kind of strong words, but good ones, I think. An evident question now emerges. I'm just about finished. If an embodied, relational, processual, post-human, affective, decolonial, post-human, pick your adjective, as one of these approaches to discursive approaches increasingly aver, difference is not epistemic, but ontological. If difference is not a perceived or a phenomenal peculiarity about one world, but an immanent function of different transversal worlds, if the roots of difference emerge from and manifest different incommensurable pluriverses, as many people argue these days, how does critique operate? I think that's the question that I'm most puzzled by. How do we do critique in a pluriverse? This is a question I don't think we're grappling with, and with which we are certainly not consistent. On the one hand, many of us turn to theorizing the relational, the plural, the multiple, the assemblage, the material, the geo-oriented social and geographical grounds, or we proclaim the need to seek other than Western modes, but we retain as part of our institutionalized domains, and this includes our professional as well as personal lives, the expectations of modern critique. Further, we reiterate them in the structures with which we operate. They inhere in the expectations of what an educated subject ought to be: individual, self-conscious, original, aware of its isolated cognitive limits. It's here that I see us as institutionalized and institutionalizing educators embroiled in a vexing tension or performative contradiction. I think we as educators are often quite comfortable problematizing subjectivity or advocating the need to decolonize or decenter, but we're often less comfortable radicalizing the gaze of critique itself. And in the, I'll just end here, but in the longer paper, I go on to, and I turn to Indigenous legal theory to explore the ways in which certain forms of grounding constitute themselves and argue for how grounding, the ontological grounds themselves, are conditions of care, and how by turning to those conditions of care, we can engage forms of self-criticism and self-consciousness that are fundamentally relational and fundamentally communal with the human and the more than human, and that are also fundamentally affirmative in recognizing the forms of care that are always already adhering in the conditions of life, in the way, you know, insects care for each other, in the way animals care for each other, in the way a plant responds to stimulus. That these are expressions of flourishing and care that actually ground a relational self-consciousness that can become an affirmative basis for how we might think about self-conscious responsibility. And fundamentally, that how cultures and peoples around the world have been doing this for a very long time, and that perhaps in a way of decolonizing critique, we can turn to those practices, those non-European practices, and see critique and learn to think about critique otherwise. So I'll just end there, and maybe we could have a discussion or a conversation about whether I should turn off my slides here. We could have a discussion about whether you feel this is a problematic or a contradiction that you recognize, or I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts as educationists.